I'm thinking maybe we'll just touch upon both of them. In other words, maybe we'll spend maybe 5 minutes or so on the typical Haftorah of the Bereshit of Genesis, and then we'll speak, hopefully the rest of the time, about the Haftorah of Machar Chodesh. Tomorrow is the new month, and we'll try to figure out what the connection is to the new month, etc. So maybe we'll do a little bit of both. That's why on the email I sent a link with both, with two Haftorahs, the Haftorah which is usually for Bereshit, for Genesis, and then the Haftorah for Machar Chodesh, for the eve of Rosh Chodesh. So I'm going to try to take advantage of the technology and share the screen a little bit and look at, maybe we'll read the Haftorah inside together, at least some of the parts, see if that works. If not, I'll just read it from the book. But in any case, just a little introduction about the Haftorah of Bereshit, of Genesis. So the beginning of, we're always looking for the connection between the Torah reading and the Haftorah, the section of the Torah and the section of the prophets. And in this instance, Bereshit, if you come tomorrow, you'll see what the portion discusses. The portion discusses, well, a very big topic. It discusses creation. What can be bigger than that? And the Haftorah also begins with Isaiah referring to the people and referring to God as this is the word of God, Borei Shamayim, the creator of heaven. So that's the parallel. But the thing here is what we're getting in the Haftorah that we're not getting in the Torah reading. In other words, what is Isaiah adding to the discussion? So one way to think about it is that if you read Genesis, you read about you're reading about the creation. But then the question becomes, what is the purpose of creation? That you don't get right away in the story of Genesis. You may have to wait to the middle of the story of Exodus. You may have to wait to the Torah being given to the Jewish people. You may have to wait to Sinai. In other words, the Torah is very clear in the beginning to tell you that God creates the world. But the big question of why, the why is not spelled out, at least not in the first portion of the Torah. And then when we look at Isaiah, which is the parallel, where he refers to God as the creator of the world, in Isaiah is very clear about what the purpose of creation is. The purpose of creation, according to Isaiah, is that the entire purpose of creation is for the people to recognize God, and in Isaiah's poetic language, is to give glory to Hashem, to sing the glory of Hashem. And in that context, the purpose of the Jewish people is to give that information to the rest of humanity. So in other words, if you're looking for a sound bite, what's the connection between the Haftorah? What does the Haftorah add over the Parsha? Is the Parsha talks about creation. But what's the purpose of creation? That's what Isaiah tells you. That's what Isaiah adds to the discussion. So that's one point. Another few points that about the Haftorah of Bereshit, and then we'll move to the Haftorah, which we'll actually read, which is the Haftorah of the day before Rosh Chodesh, is that when you read Genesis, it talks about God as the creator. But God created the world, it's in the past tense. God created in the 6 days of creation. Now, you know, you've been around long enough, you know what the Hasidic interpretation is, based on the Baal Shem Tov, and Baal Shem Tov's teachings is based on the Medrash, so it's going back a long time, but it was not necessarily explicit in the writings or emphasized, but it was in the writings. And that is that creation is not just an event that occurs in the past, rather creation is ongoing. And in this section, we see clearly how Isaiah refers to God as Borei, the creator, in the present tense. And that's where Isaiah emphasizes the concept that the Hasidic philosophy and the Kabbalah emphasize all the time, that God is invested in creation because creation must be ongoing, because if God ceases to create in every moment, the world goes back to its natural existence, which is nothingness, because the world was created ex nihilo, something from nothing. So our natural state is nothing. And the fact that we exist is because of the energy of God that continues to create us, the vitality of God, the spark of God that continues to create the universe. And therefore, as a result, there are many deep Kabbalistic principles that are derived from the concept that creation is not in the past, but creation is ongoing. Again, that's another theme that Isaiah emphasizes in this week's Haftorah. So I'm going to, like I said, I'm going to try to share the screen. I hope this works. Nah, it's not working. Everything screen included. Recorded. I hope I didn't freeze everything up here.
You're good, Rabbi.
Oh, yeah, all right. It was working? Okay.
Oh, it was working, yeah.
It was working. I'll try once more. A broadcast. For some reason.
Yeah.
It's not letting me see what I'm doing. So do you see the screen now?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, beautiful.
Yes, we see it.
Okay.
We can see it. And we also have a link.
Beautiful. Okay, so this is the Haftorah of the portion of Bereshit, the portion of Genesis. And like I said, I'm just going to read a few verses, and then we'll go to the Haftorah that is actually read because of the unique calendar of this year, where this Shabbat happens to be the Shabbat before Rosh Chodesh. So the verse starts, it's Isaiah 42, if I'm not mistaken, verse 5. And verse 5 on top of the screen, so said God the Lord, the creator of the heavens and the one who stretched them out. So here, like I said, in English, in Hebrew, it's very clear, is borei. Borei is the present tense. So this Haftarah refers to God as the creator in the present tense. And that's something that is unique to this week's Haftarah that elaborates upon the Parsha. The Parsha just says God created the world. And you have to go to the Hasidic writings or the Midrashic writings to refer to God as the creator. But here Isaiah says it clearly. Now, another theme that you see in the Parsha is the first creation is the creation of light, right? The second verse in the Bible is that the Haaretz es tohu vavohu, the earth was astonishingly empty and there was darkness above the water. And then verse 3, it says that God said, let there be light. Now, what does that verse mean? In addition to the simple meaning of let there be light, let there be energy, which is the first creation, there's also the metaphoric meaning. And the metaphoric meaning is that the state of the creation of the physical person, or the physical creation, is darkness. Why darkness? Because darkness is a metaphor, is a symbol for the opposite of enlightenment. And the physical person or the physical creation doesn't sense godliness. And because it doesn't sense godliness, it's in spiritual darkness. And the purpose of the creation is Vayomer Elohim. God says, let there be light, and there was light. And we don't just mean physical light, we also mean spiritual enlightenment. And this Haftorah keeps referring to God as opening up the eyes of the blind and taking out the person from a spiritual state of darkness. And that theme repeats itself again and again and again. So that's another parallel. In the Torah, we read about the creation of light, and in the Haftorah, we talk about the creation of metaphoric light, of knowledge, of the knowledge of God. So that I'm reading in verse 7, to open, we're going to scroll up, verse 7 on top of the page, to open blind eyes, to bring prisoners out of the dungeon, those who sit in darkness out of prison. So it means not only literal, but also figurative. And finally, we talk about what is the purpose of creation. So if you scroll up to verse 10, top of the page, sing to the Lord a new song, his praise from the end of the earth, those who go down to the sea and those therein, the islands and their inhabitants. In other words, the entire, and we continue verse 11 and verse 12, they shall give glory to the Lord and they shall recite his praise on the islands. In other words, the purpose of creation, according to Isaiah here, is that the creations should actually have a relationship with God. It should be a relationship predicated on joy, that sing to the Lord. They should recognize God and have that relationship. So just to close off this point, that is what Isaiah is elaborating upon, not just the fact that God created the world, that you get in Genesis, But here, what is the purpose? And everything God does is for that relationship with humanity, that the creation could recognize God. So everything we do within creation to allow creation to recognize God is really the purpose of creation. And then there's a relatively famous verse that I'm going to, it's not in here because it's not the Haftorah of the Chabad, it's only in the regular Haftorah, in Haftorah of Ashkenaz. So I'll skip that for right now. Okay, that's it for the Haftorah of Bereshit. Now we go to story time. Why do I say story time? This is the Haftorah of Rosh Chodesh. Let's just talk a little bit about the background, and then we'll read some of those stories inside. I'm sorry, people fell out. Oops. Okay, I'm sorry if I wasn't able to let people back in because I was on the other screen. I didn't notice. Okay, so that's the story. That's a little bit about the Haftorah of Bereshit. Now we're going to talk about the Haftorah of the day before Rosh Chodesh, which is an interesting story. So this story takes us back to the book of Samuel. In the book of Samuel, we read how Samuel appointed the first king in Israel. Who was the first king? The first king was Shaul. In English, it's Saul. So Shaul was the first king. Now, without getting into all the details, very quickly, so Saul sins. He doesn't listen to God, and the prophet Samuel, who anointed Shaul, he tells the king that God has torn away the kingdom from you, and God has given it to your friend who is better, to your friend, and later he reiterates to your friend who is better than you. And then Samuel goes off to anoint David. David is this shepherd boy. He's the youngest of his family. Nobody thinks he's anything, he's an insignificant person, but he is anointed by Shmuel. Nobody knows about it because then that would put both Shmuel, both the prophet and David's life in danger, because Shaul, the king, would obviously see the anointing of a new king as a terrible threat. So the story unfolds. You know the story. There was the battles, and ultimately David has the battle with Goliath, and eventually Shaul recognizes that David is successful in his battles with the Philistines, and eventually he actually marries Saul's daughter. So at this point he's the son-in-law of the king, but however quickly the relationship deteriorates. Because as the prophet says, there's this terrible spirit that rests upon Shaul. He's almost like depressed or saddened, and he realizes that it's probably David. David is so successful, it's probably David who's the one who is going to be the next king and ultimately be a threat to his family. So there's a few times that Shaul tries to kill David. And this happens before the story and after the story as well. Let's continue for a moment. Another part of the plot is Jonathan in English. Jonathan is the son of Shaul and very dedicated and very close to David. And at this point, as we will see, Shaul decided he wants to kill David. But David realizes that. But Jonathan does not. So Jonathan starts telling David, why don't we make peace? Why don't I bring you back to my father's home? And let's try to reconcile this relationship. David realizes that it's futile because they tried to negotiate with Shaul. He tried to show Shaul his loyalty, and to no avail. Shaul kept trying to kill David. There's a story where David is playing before King Shaul because King Shaul was saddened. There was a bad spirit that rested upon him. And then David would play the music. And then all of a sudden there's this bad spirit. The Torah refers to it as the bad spirit from Shaul. And Shaul takes his spear and tries to throw it right at David while David is playing. But David is quick. So David moves. So the spear goes right into the wall and David escapes. These are the types of things that are happening. So Shaul wants to kill David. David realizes it. David realizes it. Jonathan doesn't necessarily realize it. So they negotiate. So David and his friend Jonathan, they're talking to each other, and eventually they come to this agreement where they're going to make a test. and they're going to test Shaul's reaction. And if David is right that Shaul wants to kill him, then Jonathan will agree that David should flee, and they will make a covenant, as we will see, make a covenant that David will not harm Jonathan's family, because you know how it works. It works if there's a new king, the king wants to kill usually what happens is the king tries to kill anyone else who is a potential rival. So they make this covenant, they're going to make this covenant where Jonathan says, I'm letting you go, I'm protecting you, but in the future you'll protect me and protect my family as well. So they make the test. What's the test? The test is, Jonathan tells David, tomorrow is Rosh Chodesh. Tomorrow is the new month. Now in biblical times, the new month it's a biblical holiday. It's not, you don't have to cease to do work, but there was unique sacrifices in the temple, and it was a holiday. People made a holiday meal every Rosh Chodesh, every new month. And what Jonathan tells David is, you don't show up, you'll be missing from the meal of the king. He's the son-in-law of the king. He's a general in the king's army. He has a seat at the king's table, at the formal dinner, at the formal meal for Rosh Chodesh. So Jonathan says, you stay away, and then people will talk about you, because when you're not here, people will talk about you, which is going to be related to the Kabbalistic interpretation of what's really happening here. But that's the irony. Irony is you can be here for 20 years, no one realizes. You don't show up, you're the talk of town. So you're going to be the talk of town because you're not here. And then we'll see Shaul's response. If Shaul responds kindly, and David will say, Jonathan will say, no, where is David? And Jonathan would say, where is David? I'm sorry. Shaul, the king, will ask his son, Yonatan, where is David? Where is David? And he'd say he went to his family for a party. Now, then we'll test his response. We'll test the response. If Shaul will be enraged, we know that Shaul wants to kill David. And if he'll accept it, then we know there's peace between the king and David. Okay, how are we going to understand? How is David going to convey this information? What happens if Shaul indeed wants to kill David? How are we going to give him the information? We can't put it on Twitter. We can't send him an email. It has to be a meeting. The problem is that that if Jonathan goes to meet David, that's putting David's life in jeopardy, because everybody knows that Jonathan is David's friend. So David and Jonathan come up with this plan of how the information will be conveyed from the king, from Jonathan to David. And the plan goes something like this. It goes exactly like this. He says, the plan is like this, that they'll go out to the field the next day, and Jonathan says, I'm going to make believe I'm going to practice to shoot arrows, and I'm going to shoot the arrow. And if I shoot the arrow close to me, and I tell my helper, go get the arrows and come back, then David knows you can come back to town. But if I shoot the arrows far away, and I tell the lads, don't bother getting them, they're so far away, then what do you know, David? Then David knows you should run away, right? Run away. Why run away? Because Shaul wants to kill you. And that's the plan. They make this plan. And the story unfolds. And the first day, there's 2 days of Rosh Chodesh, as there are sometimes. The first day, David is gone. Shaul doesn't say anything. He says, no, maybe something happened. Maybe he's impure. He's impure. You go to the mikvah, you come back, you're pure the next day. So maybe he's impure. The next day, when it was the second day and David is gone, all of a sudden, now Shaul asks Jonathan, who is your friend? So Jonathan says, well, he went to his family. And Shaul is enraged. And he's so upset, not only at David, but he's upset at his own son. And he says, I know what's happening here. You are choosing the son of Yishai. You're choosing David over your own family, over your own position. And he's telling his son, you're misreading what's happening here is. You are supporting David, but really, eventually, David is going to become the king, and David is going to harm you. And he's so upset, he actually tries to kill Jonathan because he's enraged. So Jonathan now is saddened. Jonathan understands what's happening here. And Jonathan realizes that his father wants to kill David. So he goes out to the field, And he does the plan. He shoots the arrows, and he tells the lad, he says, don't bother getting them because the arrows are so distant. And now David got the message. What's David supposed to do now? David is supposed to flee. But something very strange happens instead. Jonathan, Yonatan, tells the lad, take the arrows, go back to town. And this guy goes and goes back to town. And as soon as that happens, David comes out of his hiding place in the field, and they meet up, and they embrace, and they cry, and they make a covenant, and they have a very emotional separation. And that's the conclusion of the story of the Haftorah. Again, we know that what the sages say about the love of David and Jonathan, David and Yonatan, David and Jonathan, it says when the Mishnah wants to bring an example of love that is not dependent on anything, right? It's completely for the sake of love. It uses the example of Ahavat David and Yehonatan, the love of David and Jonathan. Why? Because, of course, Jonathan has everything to lose and nothing to gain from this relationship, because David is the rival not only of his father but also of Jonathan's own ability to succeed his father and be the next king. Everyone assumed it would be Jonathan, and yet their loyalty, it runs very powerful and very deep. And that's the end of the story that we read in the Haftorah. Of course, the story in the book unfolds, and eventually that relationship ends when Shaul and his three sons, including Yonatan, are killed in battle with the Philistines. And then David announces that he recites the lament of David on Shaul and Yehonatan, some of the most beautiful verses of the Bible, where David mourns for Shaul who tried to kill him, but Shaul and Yonatan, because David realizes Shaul's greatness, even though personally they didn't get along, the understatement of the day. But in any case, that is the story of the Haftorah. Now we can do a few things. We can talk about what does that have anything to do with Rosh Chodesh. I know Sunday is Rosh Chodesh, so we read it the day before Rosh Chodesh. So we have to talk about the connection to Rosh Chodesh. That's one thing we can focus on. And then we can focus on some of the details of the story, which some of them are absolutely fascinating. And you need to read the story subtly to be able to pick up on these subtleties. So we'll do a little bit of both. I think we'll start talking a little bit about the connection between this story and Rosh Chodesh, and then we'll examine some of the specifics and glean some information. Okay, but in the meantime, if anybody has any questions and comments, please go ahead. Otherwise, we continue.
Yeah, I have a question, Rabbi. So
go ahead.
Two questions. One, the continuation of the story is that David does take care of Jonathan's son, who I think was lame.
Yes. Yes.
And then why do you think that Jonathan was passing up his chance to be king, but David to be king?
That's a good question. In other words, Jonathan is somebody who recognizes he's more objective than his father. He recognizes that David is the one chosen. You have to understand that in the Hebrew Bible, in Bereshit, in Genesis, before Jacob passes away, Jacob tells Judah, his son Judah, that the kings are going to come from Judah. Now, Shaul is from Benjamin. So Shaul was never meant to be the dynasty that's going to be the king forever. It was a temporary king, right? So, yeah, how long is temporary? It could be a generation, it could be a few generations. But we understood, people knew, I know Genesis, but Shaul and Jonathan also knew Genesis, right? So they know that eventually the kingship is going to shift from from Shaul, who's from the tribe of Benjamin, back to the tribe of Judah. They don't know who, but someone in the tribe of Judah. And here, all of the indicators indicate that it's going to be David, because they already know that Samuel says the kingship is going to be pulled away from Shaul and given to someone else. And David seems like the right guy. So Jonathan has the ability, this unique ability, to see, first of all, his relationship with David. He had a very deep relationship, but also to sacrifice from his own well-being for what he sees as the right path forward. So most people most people look at the world in a very subjective way, and the way they evaluate their friendships and their loyalties is based on what do I gain. That's why we have friends. We have friends because I like what you do for me. But that's why we say the symbol of Jonathan is a person who is not looking at the friendship based on what can I gain off this friendship, because he doesn't gain anything. His loyalty is because he recognizes and he loves David. And he understands on a personal level, he loves David, but he probably also understands that David is more fitting to be the king. And they have a lot of similarities, David and Jonathan. I don't want to go into it right now, but if you look at the battles that Jonathan battles against the Philistines, he's very similar to David. So they have a kindred spirit. They're similar to each other. They love each other. And Jonathan is not selfish. It's as simple as that. I mean, it's unique because it's unusual. It's unusual. But I think it's not. I think that Jonathan realizes that this seems to be the person that's going to be the next king. If that makes sense, I don't know. It's unusual.
Very unusual in those days to pass.
Even today, I don't want to be the king, but I'm not going to support my rival. If I'm in competition with you for whatever it may be, for a parking spot at the train station, for whatever it is, for whatever it's going to be. If I'm in competition for you, why would I support you? We're competing for the same position, right? But that's why when the Mishnah wants to say when the sages say there's an unusual concept. Newsflash: there could be a friendship which is not predicated on personal benefits. There could be a friendship, a loyalty that runs deeper than what do I stand to gain. And the symbol of that is David and Jonathan, David and Yonatan. So the fact that we emphasize this point, the sages emphasize this point, show that indeed it's unusual. Okay, so let's get back to the point of why we're reading this Haftorah, and then hopefully if we have a few minutes, I'll try to do some of the details inside, which is fascinating stuff. Okay, why do we read this Haftorah on Shabbat? The simple answer is because we scan through the Bible and we find a story that happens the day before Rosh Chodesh. Oh, so Shabbat is the day before the new moon. So the new month. So we find the story, and the opening phrase of the Haftorah, let me pull it up right here. The opening phrase of the Haftorah is, I'm not going to put it on the screen because it's going to get too complicated. The opening phrase of the Haftorah is what? Oh, here. The opening phrase of the Haftorah is, and Jonathan said to him, tomorrow is the new moon, and you will be remembered, for your seat will be vacant. Okay? So we need a story that happened the day before Rosh Chodesh. So we picked that story. Now, I understand that's a good answer because it happens to be saying, Machar Chodesh, tomorrow is the new moon. But it's strange to say that that's the only connection because we have this whole story with David and Jonathan that has nothing to do with Rosh Chodesh. Is it just a technicality? It happens to be that this story happened before Rosh Chodesh, the day before Rosh Chodesh. That's why we read it every year. Anytime we usually read the Haftorah a few times a year. If it so happens to be that Rosh Chodesh happens on Sunday, you're going to read the Haftorah, and it's not an unusual occurrence. So the point is, we keep reading the story again and again. Why? Just for the first two words. First 5 words, and Jonathan said to him, tomorrow is Rosh Chodesh. So that's why we want to look a little deeper and say, what is the connection between the concept of the story of the Haftorah and the Haftorah itself, and Rosh Chodesh itself. And I'm going to say 2 points, one more Kabbalistic and one more practical, and then we'll move on to the specific details. So the Kabbalists say as follows. What's the story of the new moon? Why the Jewish people like the moon? In other words, if you look at your calendar today, I forget today's date. Today is what? Today's October 14th, right? October 14th follows the solar calendar. We're counting time based on the sun. A full cycle around the sun, and that's a solar year. Okay, fine. Why do cultures follow the sun? Because they love the symbolism of the sun. The sun is powerful. The sun is strong. The sun gives us light. The sun is consistent. Every day you wake up in the morning, the sun is going to shine. It looks the same every day. It's wonderful. It's a wonderful thing to look up to. What do the Jewish people count time based on? Based on the moon. Now the moon is wonderful, but the moon is inconsistent. And the moon is always changing. It waxes and it wanes. And it could be great today, beautiful today, a full moon. And you know what? Tomorrow it's going to start turning down. It's never the same. And the Jewish people love the symbolism of the moon for that reason. What's wrong with consistency? Because we understand that life is a series of waxing and waning. And we're not always on the top. We're not always full. Sometimes we're going to be on the way down. Sometimes we're lacking. Sometimes we're being diminished. But the key is, and the reason why we survive until now is because we have a very interesting capacity, just like the moon, we have the capacity to recreate ourselves. So the rebirth of the moon is I have the capacity, even though for 2 nights a month, you don't see the moon at all. After the moon starts waning, gets smaller and smaller, and then there's a night or two where it's completely dark. You don't see the moon. And you give up hope and you say, look, I have no hope. And then what happens? The moon reappears. And when it reappears, it starts growing again. And that's the pattern of Jewish history. The Jewish people realize, if you look at the Jewish history, is that oftentimes you look at the sky, the night sky, and you see there's no more moon. There's nothing, there's no hope for this people. And what happens? We recreate ourselves in a different way, in a stronger way, and we're resilient because we're adaptive, and that's the moon, the ability to recreate. Okay. So that's what the moon is. Now, that's the moon. Now, let's talk Kabbalistically speaking. Kabbalistically speaking, let's look at the second half of the month. More specifically, let's look at the 2 days before the new month, before the new moon. You have darkness in the sky. There's no light at all. It looks like it's the most darkest period of the night. There's no moon. Correct. But Kabbalistically speaking, if you want to recreate yourself, you have to lose your old previous identity. You have to let go of your previous existence to be able to recreate yourself. In other words, if you wake up in the morning and what you're trying to do is just grow, advance what you already have. So this is my person, this is my career, this is what I do, these are my talents, and I'm going to do a little bit better. So yesterday I jogged for 5 miles, now I'm going to jog for 5.2. Fine, that's okay. Every day you're advancing a little bit. That's one model of growth and one model of expansion. But then there's a time where the old model falls away. You have to recreate yourself completely, and you have to grow exponentially. So now the problem is the old model holds you back. The old ways of doing things, not only they don't help you advance, but they actually get in your way. And if you really want to become something completely new, you have to let go completely of your old way of doing things, right? I'm the expert, but the problem is my expertise holds me back. I'm not going to be creative. I'm not going to come up with a new idea. I'm not going to create a breakthrough. Why am I not going to create a breakthrough? Because the experts that hold on to their expertise don't create breakthroughs because they're comfortable looking at the world the way they used to look at it, or looking at society, or looking at the economy, whatever it may be. You have to be disruptive. In other words, you have to say, I'm losing the old way of doing things. I know nothing about this problem. I'm going to approach the problem not like an expert, not like someone who did this many times before, but I'm going to approach the problem like I know nothing, like I'm ignorant, like it's a new problem. And then the breakthrough is possible. So in the language of the Kabbalah, you have to become completely diminished. You have to be, what the Kabbalah call it, batel. You have to self-nullify. You have to let go of your ego completely before you can become something new. So let's give a practical example. There's something new I want to try, but I don't want to try it. Why do I want to try it? Because I'm afraid of failure. So my ego is preventing me from trying something I never tried before. If I ran 5 miles yesterday, and now I'm going to run a little bit more, then I have no problem because it's growing little by little. That's fine. But sometimes growing little by little is not going to help because things are changing and times are changing, and we need new solutions to old problems. We have to completely recreate ourselves because the scenario is completely different. So now what we're going to say is, now you have to try something new, but you have to let go of your ego completely, forget about yourself, and then you'll be able to try something new. Otherwise, you're going to be afraid. So according to the Kabbalah, ironically, the more self-nullification you're able to exercise, the more you can let go of yourself, the more you're able to recreate yourself. Because the old model traps you. And letting go of your expertise, letting go of your perspective allows you to recreate yourself and be reborn. So from the Kabbalistic model, so when you look in the practical model, look at the 29 and a half days of the cycle of the moon around the earth. Day 1 of the month, you see a little bit of the moon, and then it waxes to day 15 when it's complete. And day 15, it starts diminishing, and day 28 and 29, it's completely dark. And then day 1, it recreates itself. So if you look at that cycle, what's the lowest part of the moon? What's the lowest part? The lowest part is day 28 and day 29 when you can't see the moon at all. But Kabbalistically, no, day 28 and day 29 is actually when all the excitement is taking place. Because day 28, 29, when you don't have any moonlight, what that represents is I'm letting go of my previous lights to be able to recreate a new light. So I'm letting go of my own ego, letting go of my own identity to be able to become something new. So the last 2 days are actually the most important days in the month, because that's when I let go of the old model to be able to grow and become something completely new. That's what the Kabbalah says. Now let's look at the verses. The first verse of the Haftorah. Vayomer lo Yehonatan. Jonathan tells to him, Machar Chodesh, tomorrow is a new month. V'nifkadecha. You will be remembered. Ki yipaked moshavecha, because your seat will be absent. Now it happens to be that the word remembered and the word vacant in Hebrew, it's the same word. V'nifkadeta. You will be remembered because your seat is absent. So it's a play on the words. I don't want to get into that right now. But what do you see here? How will you be remembered? By being absent. This is a paradox. When you're not here, this is a paradox.
And if they have any questions, just go down to Dennis.
This is the paradox. When you're not here, when you could remove your ego, that's when you're remembered. That's when you're counted. That's when the new you could emerge. So that is the Kabbalistic interpretation. It's not just that it happens Erev Rosh Chodesh, the day before Rosh Chodesh. On the day before Rosh Chodesh, we realize that when there's no light at all, if you can let go of your own ego completely, that's when you'll be able to become a new moon. That's the practice. That's the Kabbalistic interpretation. If you want to tie it into the rest of the story, there is here a conflict between Shaul. Jonathan is stuck in the middle. Jonathan, of all the players in this puzzle, Jonathan probably has it the worst. David also has a difficult time because he has to run away from his family, from his wife. His wife is the daughter of Shaul, even though his wife is loyal to him. But if he's going to stay with his wife, Shaul would catch him and kill him. So David is on the run. So David is in a very difficult position. But arguably, Jonathan is even in a worse position. Why? Because Jonathan has to choose between his father and his friend. And that's a very, very difficult position to be with. To be in. But in some cases, Jonathan really, the real conflict here between Shaul and David is really a conflict between the past and the future, right? Shaul was the first king. Samuel said, you're not going to be the king anymore. What does Shaul want to do? Shaul wants to maintain the old order. He wants to maintain the status quo. David represents the new moon. David represents the future. Kabbalistically, David is also Malchut, which is the moon, but we're not going to go into it right now. Let's speak very practically. Shaul sometimes is political change. And there's certain people in society who are invested in keeping the old system intact. And then there are forces in society which understand that the world is changing and what society needs is changing. And therefore they're looking to the future. And in some sense, Jonathan is stuck being pulled between Shaul, which is he's going to be the continuation of the past, which is the throne of Shaul, or is he going to be loyal to David, which represents the future? And the ability to choose David is the ability to recreate. We're going away from the model of Shaul, moving to the model of David. And that's another connection between the content of the story and the concept of Rosh Chodesh. So that is the first point I wanted to make, the connection between the story and Rosh Chodesh. There's another point that I want to make because I just read it recently and it's absolutely fascinating and entertaining. It's a good story. So if we have 5 minutes, I think I'll be able to do it in 5 minutes. But before then, if anybody wants to make any comments, please go ahead. And then if not, we'll go into the details of the story, which is at least entertaining, at least for me.
Rabbi, well, just one comment. The moon,
Yes.
the moon, similar to David and Jonathan's relationship, just to make a link between the two, there's a very feminine energy. The moon has more of a feminine energy. The sun has more of a masculine energy. And I think in David and Jonathan's friendship as well, there's something about, it's not, like, as you said, it's not sort of what's in it for me.
Right.
It is more of a giving quality to it.
Yes.
And I
Yes,
think
that makes sense.
The moon also, it has that, the moon, like a woman, has those sort of the cycles as opposed to the.
Yeah, that's clear. And if you want to get Kabbalistic, Shaul is from the tribe of Benjamin. Benjamin is the attribute of Yesod, which is more masculine, and David is more feminine. And then Jonathan has to choose where his loyalties are going to lie. But yes, that's we can go on and on about this. That's the more Kabbalistic interpretation. Thank you, Beth. Thank you. Yeah. Now let's turn to a moment to some of the practical things of the story, and I just think it's interesting. Here we go. I have to find it. Okay, I'll give it to you by heart, and then I'll show it to you in the verses. Basically, if you look at the code, they had to make a code. How is Yonatan going to alert David that there's danger? They can't meet up. Why can't they meet up? Because they suspect that if Shaul wants to kill David, then there's a meeting between Jonathan and David will expose David and get David killed. So they assume that if Shaul wants to kill David, Jonathan is not going to be able to meet up with David directly. David has to be in hiding. And that's why they make this plan. And the plan has two elements. One element is what Jonathan is going to do, and the other thing is what Jonathan is going to say. And the reason why they have to make a double plan is because they're not exactly sure how it's going to unfold. Jonathan comes to the field. Will he come alone? Will the Secret Service follow him? Will the police follow him? If you're in the FBI and you want to catch David, and presumably if Shaul is trying to kill David, they want to catch David and kill David, the best way to get to David is to find Jonathan, because Jonathan is his best friend. So Jonathan doesn't even know if he's going to be able to be alone in the field with David. When he gets to the field, he doesn't know if David is going to be hiding. He doesn't know where David's going to be hiding. Is David going to be close to where he is, or is David going to be far? He doesn't know. So they make a double sign. What's the double sign? It's what Jonathan is going to do and what he's going to say. So if Shaul is not upset at David, then Jonathan is going to throw the arrow. When he shoots the arrow, he's going to shoot it close. If Shaul is upset at David, then Jonathan is going to throw the arrow very far away to the distance, symbolizing, go, get out of here. So that's one sign. That's the sign of what they're going to do. Then there's also what he's going to say, because it's possible at the moment he shoots the arrow, David is hiding behind the bush and David doesn't see the shooting of the arrow. Again, they don't know how meeting is going to unfold. So therefore, in addition to the action, he also says, I'm going to say something. What is he going to say? If Shaul is close, if Shaul wants to kill, is happy with David, doesn't want to kill David, then Jonathan is going to say, hey lad, the arrows are close, meaning you could stay close to town. If Shaul is upset at David, then he's going to shoot the arrows far and say, hey lad, the arrows are so far away. Why don't you come back to town? But if he says the arrows are so far away, then David knows I got to go keep far away. That's the sign that the Torah, that the prophets are are, that the book writes clearly. Okay, I'm going to read it quickly. Let's go back here for a second. He says as follows, and I shall shoot, this is Jonathan speaking, verse 20 in the link that I sent. And I shall shoot 3 arrows to the side, as though I shot at a mark. In other words, as if I'm going shooting to target shooting, to practice my target shooting. And behold, I shall send the youth, saying, go find the arrows. If I say to the youth, behold, the arrows are on this side of you, take it and come, for it is well with you, and there is nothing to the matter as the Lord lives. In other words, I promise you that if the arrows are close, I tell the lad, here, the arrows are close, take them and come. But if I say thus to the youth, behold, your arrows are beyond you, go, for the Lord has sent you away. In other words, Bahala, it's distant. Go, because the Lord has sent you. And then he says, we'll make the agreements. That sounds, so far it's all logical. The problem is that the next day, what actually happened, 2 days later, what actually happened, that's not what happened. What happens is, they do this plan, because Jonathan realizes that his father wants to kill David. So he shoots the arrows to the distance. And then he tells the lad, go far. The arrows are very far. But then, new plan. Then he says, go to the city, go back to the city. And when he goes back to the city, David emerges and Jonathan and David meet up. And it's a very emotional meeting. Oh, that's not in the plan. How did David know to come out of the hiding place? Maybe it's a trap. What's happening here? Okay, so this is a twist in the plot that we would not have expected. So one interpretation is, well, they made a technical way of conveying information. But that's not good enough, because in addition to conveying the information, they also have an emotional bond. And just making a sign about the arrows is not enough to convey the emotional bond between David and Jonathan, and therefore they really want to meet. So the moment David is able, Shaul is able, the moment Jonathan is able to get his lad out of the way, then David emerges and they meet. That's the simple answer. But then there's a very important subtlety here that I read this morning, and I want to share it because it's very nice. And you don't always see it. So there was a third sign. I told you 2 signs. One sign I told you is that if he's upset, if Shaul is upset, then David is going to send the arrow. Then Jonathan is going to shoot the arrow to the distance, and he's going to tell the lad the arrow is very far. So if David hears, if he sees the arrows, he'll know you got to get out of here. If he doesn't see the arrows, but he hears Jonathan speaking, then he knows he's telling them the arrows are far. He knows to leave. That's the 2 signs. But the truth of the matter is there was a third sign that's not written explicitly, but it's written subtly. And that is, if you trace the verses and you see how Jonathan is going to refer to the lad, there are 2 words in Hebrew to refer to lad that both appear in this section. Number 1 is na'ar. Na'ar is young man, beautiful. But then there's another word. So in verse 21, the verse says, and behold, I shall send the youth. Na'ar. If everything is good, if the king is not upset at you, he refers to him as na'ar, youth. Verse 21, if there's a problem, but if I say thus to the youth, behold, the arrows are beyond you, go, for the Lord has sent you away. If I shoot it too far and I tell the youth the arrows are too far away, then you know to leave. But this time, it doesn't say the word na'ar. In English, there's only 1 word. So they say youth both in verse 21 and in verse 22. But in Hebrew, there's 2 words. There's na'ar and there's elem. Verse 22, he refers to him as elem. Now, ela comes from the word concealment, laha'alim, to conceal. Basically, just by the way he refers to the lad, he could say na'ar. Na'ar is just a regular way of referring to him. But if he says elem, which comes from the word concealment, what does that mean, David? Conceal yourself. Get out of here. So that's a subtlety. It doesn't say it clearly, but you see clearly in verse 21, when everything is good, he refers to him as na'ar. Verse 22, when there's a problem, he says, I'm going to refer to him as elem. So now we have three signs, two that the Torah says subtly and one that Jonathan doesn't point out, but you could see clearly that it refers to him as Na'ar when everything is good, refers to him as Elem when things are bad. Now Elem, because Elem means concealment. Okay, here comes the drama. Now, Shaul is very upset at David. So Jonathan has to go and he has to tell David there's a problem, get out of town. So what does he do? He does the two signs. He throws the arrows in the distance. And he tells the guy, the arrows are so far. How does he refer to the lad? Based on what we just said, he should refer to him as Elem. Elem is from the word lad, which means concealment. Go conceal yourself. But surprisingly, he does not refer to him as Elem. The verse says Na'ar almost 10 times. If you look at the story when it plays out, I'm looking at verse 35. And it was in the morning that Jonathan went out at David's appointed time, and that a small boy was with him. And he said to his boy, it keeps referring to him, and the lad came up. So forget about the English. And Jonathan called after the lad. He keeps referring to him as Na'ar. Now, I just told you Na'ar is the word that just means lad. It does not mean conceal. We're only supposed to use the word Na'ar if everything is good. Here, Jonathan mixes it up. Instead of saying Elam, which means lad, which means conceal yourself, he says Na'ar. What's going on? What is he signaling to David? The answer is as follows, perhaps. The answer is that he's signaling to David, if you look at the first time where this is written, and it was in the morning, that Jonathan went out to David's appointed time, and a small boy was with him. What does it mean, a small boy? In the Bible, katan, small, doesn't mean young in age. It means immature. Basically, what's happening here is Jonathan realizes that the lad who's securing him is helping him, which David is afraid of, because we don't know how many people are going to secure Jonathan to the field. We don't know Shaul's people want to kill David. So from the perspective of Jonathan and David, the lad trying to help Jonathan is really a threat to David. But what does Jonathan realize on the way out to town? This kid is a fool. This kid, you can trick him. And that's what they do. They send him back to town. Now, if you're the lad protecting Jonathan, and Jonathan says, why don't you go back to town? What are you going to do if you're in the FBI? You can say, okay, I'm going back to town. You say, no, I'm sticking around. There's going to be a meeting here. I'm meeting with David. I'm going to stick around. But Jonathan recognizes that this kid is a kid you can get rid of. And that's why I refer to him as a young lad. And indeed, the guy goes back to town. So now when he refers to David, now when he's talking to David, he does the trick. He uses two of the signals, which means there are trouble. But the other signal, the third signal, is he a Nar or is he a Elem? Is he a child, or should he Elem, land, which comes from the word conceal yourself? He doesn't say conceal yourself. Because what does he want? He wants David to come out and he wants to meet. So that's the brilliance here, where Jonathan is able to convey to David, there's danger, but it's safe enough to meet. And that's what happens. And that's not written clearly in the verse. But if you follow the verses carefully, and you'll do so on Shabbat, and you read the Haftorah, you will see this subtlety where the Elem is another sign, Na'ar or Elem. Elem means conceal yourself. And now, when Jonathan realizes that he can get rid of this security, and he can have a private meeting, he tells David there's two of the signs, which means flee, and one of the signs that means you don't have to conceal yourself, we can meet up. And they have that very emotional meeting. I believe it's the last meeting they have in their lifetime. So that is a little bit of a subtlety within the story. So what we did is hopefully we gave a summary of the story. We talked about the connection to Rosh Chodesh. We talked about the practical connection. It happened to be the day before Rosh Chodesh. We talked about the political connotation. Rosh Chodesh is the new moon. It's the idea of rebirth. You have to be able to move forward in the future. And that's basically the choice of Jonathan. Is he going to stick in the past with his father, or be loyal to David, which is the future? And in other words, recreating the political scene in Israel. That's one perspective. And then we had the Kabbalistic perspective of specifically by being absent, you'll be remembered. Specifically when the moon has no light, do you know that a rebirth is coming? Specifically, if I can get rid of my ego completely, if I can set my ego aside, I'm not afraid to look at problems from a new angle. I'm not afraid to do things that I have not done before, because I totally put myself aside, put my ego aside completely. That's when I can recreate myself. And that's the message. That's the Kabbalistic message of Rosh Chodesh. And then finally, there's the idea of that subtlety with the sign, and that's how David knew he's able to come out and he doesn't have to hide. So this is a taste of what's happening in this Haftorah. A lot more to say. Beautiful story, beautiful drama, a lot of meaning here. But I think for today will suffice. Thank you very much for joining. If anyone has any comments or questions, please stick around and share. Otherwise, have a wonderful day, and we hope to see you in